Hello, friends. Welcome aboard the Round Trip Stories podcast, where we share stories of moving around the world and back again, reflecting on the lessons we've learned along the way. My name is Tracy.
And my name is Melissa, and we are so glad you're joining us for today's episode. Our guest today is Amanda Bates, employer branding strategist, storyteller, and transitions consultant, who is also the founder and creative director of The Black Expat, a website for Black identity and international living. Amanda is the host of the Global Chatter podcast and happens to be a third culture kid from the United States who spent her growing up years in Cameroon. In this episode, Amanda shares about spending her teen years in her parents' country of birth, where her Black identity was affirmed and her global curiosity was launched, and David Pollock planted the seed that Amanda was a third culture kid. So buckle your seatbelts and make sure your tray tables and seats are in their upright positions as part one of Amanda's round trip story gets ready for takeoff.
Hello and welcome to our Round Trip Stories podcast. We have an amazing guest today, Amanda Bates. She's the founder and creative director of The Black Expat and a third culture kid. And so her interest in navigating cross-cultural spaces and identities started young. Her American-born, African-raised perspective continues to influence her as she leads the creative direction of The Black Expat and tells the stories that need to be told. She has traveled 5 continents, lived on 3, and proud of her uncanny ability to recite 1990s music lyrics in the most random situations. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi, guys. I'm glad to be here. This is going to be fun.
We're so thankful that you could make the time today. You're in North Carolina. We're in California.
Yeah, I feel like we've been trying to do this for a while, so this is nice.
Yes, and Amanda is a podcast host. Global Chatter, right?
Yep. Although, let me be honest. So I've done 4 seasons. We're in a little bit of a hiatus, but it'll be back.
We're so glad to get to have you on our podcast. Thank you for making time to join us as our year-long TCK series that we have been doing. It's been great to get to talk to so many TCKs and hear their stories, and we're glad to wrap up this series with interviewing you. So as we get started, the first thing we like to do is start with a little bit of the backstory, as we like to call it. So tell us first a little bit about yourself and your life now, and then tell us a little bit about your family and where you grew up.
Sure. I always think it's really funny, these questions that TCKs get asked about the backstory, because they're like, you guys want it short. And as we all know, everything starts with, well, then I was here, and then I was there, and then I moved back over here.
Yeah.
So currently, I'm in North Carolina. Actually, so when I was a little kid, my family moved here. My parents are immigrants. And then I was like, oh, I'm always going to come back to North Carolina. And then I decided to go to college here when I got older. And then I went away, and then I got a job here after many years. And so that's what kind of got me in North Carolina. And so life's pretty interesting right now. I mean, I work in marketing and branding, which is kind of cool. Many people know me from working in academia for a very long time. So I worked in higher ed. I worked with underserved first-generation students for a decade with a nonprofit. I was a career services director for like 4 or 5 years. I worked in that world before I made a pivot into banking. And people ask, how did you do it? And I'm like, well, it's just being a TCK. I knew how to use my skills to like tell my story and jump from point A to point B. So, but the short version is I work in employer branding for a pretty big international bank and basically help them actually tell their story as to why they are an employer of choice, particularly to international audiences.
Okay. So tell us about your family. Did you have siblings?
Okay. So, yes. So my parents originally were from Cameroon. I was born here. I have an older sibling that was born in Cameroon, but did not grow up here. And then I have a younger brother. And so I grew up born in D.C., initially raised in Northern Virginia, moved to North Carolina, then moved to Maryland. Then they decided to repatriate for them to Cameroon. But my parents are part of the English minority, and we actually moved to the capital city that's Francophone. And if you know Cameroon, majority of it is French speaking. So so I spent a year in the English speaking side where I was homeschooled. And then I went to a local school, and then my mom got a job in the capital city. So then I spent my middle and high school years at the international schools there. Um, One that was the American school. So then in 10th grade, I ended up going to one of the missionary high schools because that was the only school, international school, that covered up into 12th grade. And then I left Cameroon. My family stayed. I was 17. I moved back and went to the largest state school in the state of North Carolina, which is really interesting when your graduating class is like 15.
So culture shock.
So, and at that time, they didn't even know what to do with their culture kids. And so my family stayed in Cameroon. I was here. That's a story of adjustment in and of itself. And then my parents ended up getting divorced, and my mom came with my siblings back here.
So we'll go ahead and get into the time that you were in Cameroon, and you said your parents were repatriating, but you weren't. So why don't you tell us a story or memory about your time growing up in Cameroon?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's kind of interesting to talk about for two reasons. Like, before I even get to the experience of moving to Cameroon, I didn't want to go to Cameroon. I was an American kid who grew up in the States, right?
Yeah.
So I was essentially a kid who had immigrant parents, and that's a lot of kids in the United States, right? And that was me being a cross-cultural kid before that was a term, and obviously Ruth Van Vaken added that onto the second version of the book. And so I'd been to Cameroon once when I was little. I was really young, and if you ask my much older cousin now, I just have this memory of I got sick and I think I like pooped in my diaper. And it's odd because I actually remembered that experience being very little, and that was the only experience I really had of Cameroon in my mind until I went when I was 10. And my family moved in January, which I think it's a really hard time to move in the middle of the school year, right? And so, it wasn't easy because I left a place where I was in the minority, but I've always sounded like this. So there was some blending in, even though my parents clearly were immigrants to the country, they were adjusting and whatnot. And then you go to a place where you look like the majority, but you don't sound like the majority, and you have very different experiences. So one thing I've learned, even as I've grown up as a traveling adult in even predominantly Black spaces, is that people still know you're not from there. So that first year was really rough. I got actually quite sick, to be honest, because I think it was change of climate, malaria, because that's a malaria zone. Had to deal with that.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. I've dealt with it as a kid actually quite a bit. And I think, even having family that was there, extended family, I grew up very different from my cousins. I grew up very different from the rest of the family. I think the other thing that becomes interesting is when you start to look at privilege, because once again, irrespective of what your life looks like in the US, and as we know, all of us know, there's so many different like economic classes and where people sit even within middle, lower, or upper. You're coming from the West and you're going into a country that is then considered developing. So the assumptions of who you are and what you have, and even what you have, is still more than what the local population has access to. So honestly, the first year sucked really bad. But I think I've always said that, just because there were layers upon identity layers where I don't think my parents, they couldn't have anticipated it because it had never been their experience as a kid, right?
Right.
And then I think you then add going into a part of the country where they're not historically from.
Another layer.
And don't speak the language, right?
Another layer.
So I was in 5th grade when I left. I homeschooled 5th grade. 6th grade, I was in a local school. 7th grade, I went to the American School of Yaoundé. Yeah, I mean, I think where things started to settle for me is when I got to the American school. So that would have been 7th grade.
Okay.
Wow. So many layers. And I
Mm.
appreciate you describing all of them because they have everything to do with our experiences when we are moving around the world.
Mhm.
Language, history of colonization, culture, and even like difference between the parents and the kids. All right, you described a little bit of that hard first year, but was there anything else that you'd like to tell us about what was hard moving to Cameroon?
Yeah, I think, not to belabor the point, but I really think the class differential can't be underestimated, right? And I don't want to get too early in the repatriation story, but so much of the perception of what an American is and what an American has
Mm-hmm.
was really a real big theme, I think, of kind of my early years there. And to
Mm-hmm.
be honest, I don't think it ever really shook because once again, I ended up going to the international schools, right? So then that just kind of perpetuates
Mm-hmm.
kind of that concept.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and one thing I say though is that I am happy that I grew up in Cameroon, even with some of the challenges that came, because from an identity standpoint, as far as how I view myself and my Blackness, it was actually really helpful to prepare me for when I came back to the States.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if you talk to Black TCKs that have grown up, particularly in Black countries, it's a real interesting theme that you'll see come across, especially when they find themselves moving either to the West, particularly to the US, Canada, the UK. And one thing that would come up often is I always felt like I had a sense that my Black identity was affirmed.
Hmm.
And I'm glad that it was affirmed because when you move into these other countries, it's not always going to be affirmed. But because you had kind of those formative years outside of it, you can really see a nuance in the conversation, particularly around race and identity and Blackness, that
Mm-hmm.
you're not very aware of when you're a teenager or when you're a kid going through it.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're older and you're kind of looking around at some things, you kind of go, yeah, okay, fine. Maybe this country didn't have everything. Maybe this country was developing, but it wasn't weird to see a Black president. It wasn't weird to see Black leadership. It wasn't weird to see Black CEOs. It wasn't weird to see Black lawyers. Like that wasn't
Yeah.
a thing.
Right.
And then kind of moving into spaces where it's not, that's when you realize, oh, I'm really glad that I saw that because there's a bit of a resolve that I have that I've been kind of blessed to have that some folks
Yeah.
haven't had. So it's not a core memory, but it's almost like a culmination of the good
Mm-hmm.
experience of growing up in Cameroon.
Mhm.
I mean, here's the thing. If I take it away from there, I mean, I love the fact that in high school, like we would play rugby in the mud, in the rain, right? Because tropical storms, it's great. I love the fact that I was like the third best player in street hockey, and the first two were guys, and one was Canadian and one was Swiss. I love the
Nice,
fact
Amanda.
I love the fact that, we could walk down the street and grab whatever fruit we wanted to eat because we lived in tropics. So mangoes were a common thing. Should
Oh,
we be in class? Sure. Are we cutting class to go get mangoes? Absolutely. Um,
mm,
I think that I have so many great memories, I think, of the fact that, at our school, we would go to the beach at least once or twice a year, like it would be like a retreat or a trip, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
there was so many really cool parts of that I'm really grateful that I had because it's not typical for kids, particularly in the States. And
No.
so I'm grateful for that.
so many amazing things that you experienced and that were also gifted to you inside as an identity that you could bring back. How important that is. Um, Anything else you want to tell us about what you loved about living in Cameroon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the start for me of this global curiosity, right? And I think that's not necessarily unique to me, but I think anytime you get the opportunity to have these experiences, which once again, you're a kid, so you don't think of them as being different from other people's, it's just your life. But I think that was the start very directly of me going to these international schools of, oh yeah, I am definitely meeting people who are across the world. I'm definitely meeting people who I'm curious about where they come from. Like my favorite subject has always been social studies.
Uh-huh.
And then I really loved geography. And I was really fortunate at the American school. You know, God rest his soul, Mr. Ed Carmo. He was my middle school social studies teacher the entire time. And he taught us this love of understanding history and geography in a way
Mm,
that I was a little flummoxed when I started working with students here and they did not like these subjects. And it's so funny how much of it as a kid, it was sort of like, oh, I just need to do the schoolwork or whatever. But now how much I retain because of the way he taught.
mm,
And so I think a lot of my memories too is kind of, at that time, we had these really good teachers that really wanted to make sure we were
mm,
plugged in and
mm.
really connected. And this is before social media and before like when I graduated, it was just the start of like people getting email, right? Like general public.
Yeah.
Us
Uh-huh.
too.
And it was just interesting how much curiosity those teachers fostered, not just in what they were teaching, but also connecting it to the fact of where we were. So if I think about another teacher, Mrs. Noss, she was from Florida, but she taught literature and English. But one of the things that I remember her doing, and this was super cool, is that she intentionally did a section on African literature because we were in Africa and we were in West Africa.
Mm,
And so that's when we got introduced to the Wole Soyinkas. That's when we got, um, introduced to the Chinua Achebes. That's when we got introduced to African writers that maybe wouldn't have happened until maybe we went to college and picked a particular class around that. And I
yeah.
remember even as an adult, that still kind of landed on me that she wanted to make sure that even though we were in this American environment, that we also remembered where we were. And we were very
Mhm,
connected historically and very connected
mhm.
to the culture and to literature, even if that wasn't necessarily what the curriculum would say.
Oh, that's such a great point about international schools and making sure that even though they have a British curriculum or a French curriculum or American curriculum, that they are deeply tied to their place.
Mhm.
Because it would be a loss for the children and the teenagers if they didn't learn the history and didn't experience the literature of their place.
And I just think, no matter where in the world you are, in whatever context, just God bless good teachers. They're just
Amen.
a treasure.
You know what's really funny about Cameroon? So I travel quite a bit. And when I moved to Cameroon at that time, that was the year of the World Cup in Italy. And Cameroon had a legendary run if you are a soccer player or a football
Mm,
follower or whatever. And I would travel, like I went to Uruguay. I was in Argentina on my way to some part of somewhere, and I think I had a Uruguayan taxi driver from the airport. I can't speak a lick of Spanish, and he said, "Where are you from?" And then, I'll say the US, but then I somehow weaved in Cameroon, and he looked at me and he was like, "Oh, wait, I know the football team that won in 1990." And I was like, "I got you. You're Uruguayan." Forlan is a really big Uruguayan football. So what Cameroon gave me is that before I moved to Cameroon, I knew nothing about soccer. I know enough about players in different countries that when in doubt, when I get into conversations with people, I'll say Cameroon, they'll go, "Oh yeah." And I'm able to also converse with them about whatever players from the country that they have. And so, yeah, I mean, even that little tiny bit of like being in a
mhm.
soccer country, you'd be amazed how many times around the world, particularly like Latin America, where people are just like, yes.
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Connection. Athletics really do create connection. I tell my husband can talk to anybody in the world because he knows all about soccer, of course, but then he also knows about cricket. And so that covers all the
Yeah.
former British colonies. And so he can just talk to anybody about any
Mhm.
sport, and it's such a connector. Yay
Yeah.
for sports.
Yeah.
Yeah, sports and teachers.
There you go.
So, Amanda, tell us a story about when you realized that you were a TCK.
Okay, so this is super funny because there was no realization per se, but I got a definition, and this is where David Pollock comes in.
Okay.
So I was a junior in high school at the time, I believe, and school decided to have an assembly, and they said we've got the speaker. And I remember this white guy came in who looked like Santa Claus, and it was not Christmas. And I remember actually being really hungry, like, why is this guy talking? And he was standing up there and he was talking about this experiences of like, living between cultures and, particularly as kids and what that experience is and repatriation and whatnot. And all of my friends were kind of looking at him like, what is this guy talking about? So he's talking. And at one point he says, you may not get it now, but you'll get it in the future. Now, we're all 15, 16, 17. And I didn't really get what he was saying until I graduated. I went to college, right? And it started to kind of settle in because up until that time, I just assumed, look, I'm this American kid in this international school, which is true, right? Because we all were like, I'm American, I'm French, I'm Thai, I'm whatever, right? And it's when I came back to the States where I started to really think about some of the things he said. And at that point, though, I did not use the term TCK. And I think it was as I got older and it definitely sat with me in my 20s, and I was keeping up with my friends from high school, and I had a big birthday at one point, and it was a bunch of folks that I happened had gone to international school with at different stages, and we're all just sitting, and all of a sudden it gets quiet, and someone goes, "Yeah, I had a really hard time." That's all the person said.
Hmm.
And at this point, we're probably anywhere between 27 and 30, and it was that point where the conversations really started happening about what were the nuances and the challenges of kind of growing between. And so you've got to imagine the person who said it, longtime State Department kid, right? His dad's been ambassador wherever. The person I'm looking across was a Korean diplomatic kid. I was sitting next to someone who was a development aid worker kid, and we were all just sort of like, yeah, this has been kind of a weird thing, right? And so I think that's when I first had the proper awareness to use the term, but I'd been having the experiences, but amongst ourselves, we didn't say it because, like I said, it wasn't a thing. I mean, we're all stateside, right? When you look at TCKs in the U.S. And I think about that particularly when I came to college for American kids who had grown out, like, you're not labeled as an international student, right? So you don't, at the school I was going to at the time, those pre-orientation benefits and services were not open to American kids, right?
Right.
So even though it would have been beneficial, I couldn't go because I was tagged as an American, right?
That's a good point. And so so how do you identify and gather those students to be able to support them? I think that now that there's more awareness of the TCK, the third culture kid, I know that being on different university websites, sometimes they'll say, oh, this is for international students and third culture kids. I've seen that. So that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That has been I told you guys I was in academia for a while, right? And somewhere in there, I have a counseling degree and I have an MBA. So my brain is always like thinking like both sides of it.
You're well-rounded.
But what I was going to say is that is really a result of the last like 10 to 12 years, because at one point I was also working with TCKs, like I had a bit of a consulting practice as well. And colleges really started to kind of lean in because I think it was something that TCKs themselves were raising awareness. But at one of the universities that I worked at, it was interesting because it was actually a career services professional who knew my background and said, hey, I've got these students who have, this background. How can we support? And so I can even look at that university and say, when I started interacting with them, and now they've come leaps and bounds because once again, someone who understood the term and read the book said, we've got these students, we need to support them.
Yeah. Amanda, you've mentioned a couple times about the book. What's the title of the book that you're talking about?
Oh my gosh.
Between Worlds?
Is it between? I was going to say, is it Growing Up Between Worlds? I call it the Third Culture Kid Bible. Like, I have it. But yeah.
Yeah. Third culture kids growing up among worlds.
Amongst worlds. There you go.
So, Amanda, you mentioned a little bit about your parents before, not having had your experience. Is there anything that you can think of now, or rather, what do you wish that your parents would have realized back then or known about your experience moving to Cameroon?
I think it's a common thing with a lot of parents. Like, your blind spot is that's a country you've grown up in. So you're not thinking of, I don't think anyone thinks about this. What's it like not to grow up in the country that you're familiar with? Because you kind of have to shift your mind in order to think about, well, what does this experience look like for my kids? I think my parents had a really interesting experience. Like, look, I was moving to a place I'd never been. They were moving back to a place they were familiar with, but they hadn't lived in that region. But I also have to remember that my parents had just come from being an immigrant somewhere else. I think what's really interesting, and with the populations I work with, we see so many people that are moving self-directed that I do have to kind of think through with them, okay, you don't have the networks that a State Department or an educational provider or a missionary group will give you. I actually have to sit down with them and say, hey, you're moving with these kids. Have you had a conversation about the why and the opportunity? And have you let them grieve? And have you figured out how to make them feel comfortable when homesickness and loneliness hits in? And what kind of education do you want to put them in? Because you can't, I don't know why people do this. You can't just drop kids into like a different type of schooling system and assume and say that they are flexible. I sometimes get a little concerned when everyone talks about all the positives. And they don't have the conversation through what the challenges are. I think that if you're having a conversation with your child up front about what could be the challenges or let them express themselves, I think that's being honest about what this could be. But I think it's really interesting when I have conversations with folks who are like, oh yeah, my kids got this experience and this, that, and whatever, and it was great, and they were TCKs, and I'm sort of going, I think that, are you trying to assuage guilt? And also, I'm old enough to know TCKs who hated their experience.
Yeah.
So, that's not the positive answer, but like it's the reality of.
Well, yeah, because and even though, we love to quote the statistic about how many kids wouldn't take their experience back and how many are thankful for their experience. And yet there are still kids who do have a really difficult time. And, for whatever, it can be so many different reasons. And it's important for parents to be aware of that. And so I think you're right that we as parents need to acknowledge that, yes, there are good things to be thankful for in every situation, but that doesn't mean that there aren't also really hard things that have to be talked about and that kids need support through. And I'm thankful for organizations like TCK Training and others that, that this is all so much more talked about now because I think that a lot more parents are equipped now to recognize and just the impact on mental health that growing up and living in another culture has. It is significant.
No, and there's a lot more organizations that are out now. And look, if you look at the data from kind of the top 3 reasons why for people who go with sending agencies, they fail. Family independence. You know what I mean? I think about when I was a kid, and there were definitely some situations where families had to cut short their time because
Mm-hmm.
there was some family issues there.
And depending on where you are and who you're working with and what you're doing, you may not have the support network to be able to stay where you are. And that's kind of one of the factors that was the situation for my family. Is different members of our family were struggling with different things, and we did not have the support network that we would have needed in order to be able to stay where we were. And, that wasn't the whole story of why we ended up moving back earlier than we had planned, but that was part of it. And yeah, it's a real possibility that can happen.
One of the things that I appreciate about the organization that we were with in China is that they did have a lot of support. And so they would bring in a counselor every so often that would travel to the different school sites that our organization managed and give us free counseling. When we were getting ready to come to repatriate, we went through a seminar about it. We even had a marriage seminar. And I really appreciate their attention to the support that they brought in, because we need that. We don't have our extended family and our support systems back in our home countries. And so it's wonderful when organizations are doing all of that support
Proactively.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even in preparing students to repatriate, I was having a conversation with someone, and I was just like, honestly, what would have been a really good conversation was, as we talk about identity, you've got particularly Black and brown students who are going back to the States, where their identity is a completely different story than wherever they've been, and even if they've been a minority. How are we preparing students for that? Because that was a direct question from a friend of mine who her dad works at the UN and said, I'm terrified for my brother because he is coming to live in New Jersey. And being Black here is very different than being Black in Ghana or being Black in some of these other places. And so I think conversations are shifting, probably not as fast as I want them to, but but they are getting there slowly.
Yeah. Thanks, Amanda, for everything you've shared so far. We are looking forward to getting to hear more of your stories in part 2 for the next episode.
Thank you, Amanda, for sharing your round-trip stories from Cameroon. You found joy in growing up in a place where mangoes could be had when you were supposed to be in class, or you could play a game of rugby in the mud after a tropical rain. You saw Black presidents, lawyers, CEOs, and leadership, which gave you resolve that you took back to the United States. As you reflect on your time as a TCK, you know that the term is nuanced for every child, and you encourage parents to keep their eyes wide open as they consider or are raising their child outside their home countries. So, what happened when Amanda returned to the U.S. for university? You'll have to make a return trip to our podcast for part 2 of Amanda's round-trip story.
Want the podcast equivalent of early boarding and first-class seating? Be sure to subscribe to the Round Trip Stories podcast in your favorite podcast app and sign up for our email list at roundtripstories.com so you'll never miss an episode. We believe that sharing stories helps our understanding of the world grow larger while the distance between us grows smaller.
As this episode lands, we hope these stories have encouraged you, helped you find some more of your belongings, and made your baggage a little lighter. Thanks so much for listening, friends. We'll see you next time.
I just have to say, I really, really miss fresh mangoes so much.
Yeah.
I
Not the same when you got to get it from the store. It's a
and
little.
They've shipped. They were picked so green and shipped so far.
It's a lot more entertaining to take a rock and try and not hit someone's house and literally get it along the way. And in one case, get a rock, hit it. We're all standing there eating it, and then something else falls out of the tree, and it was a snake, and we're all screaming. It was actually quite funny.